May 17th marks the 60th anniversary of the landmark Brown decision. Much has been written in recent weeks on this occasion, at this milestone anniversary, as we consider how far we've come and where we need to go to fulfill the promise of Brown. We're marking this anniversary here at TC. We're bringing together distinguished experts whose work focuses on creating real, sustainable diversity in both schools and housing to strengthen America's suburban communities. Brown was a watershed event in the 20th century civil rights movement, spurring gains in state and federal legislation and encouraging civil rights activists to press for further progress on other fronts, such as housing, voting, and employment. But what has Brown meant for our schools over these 6 decades? The decision held great promise to end the pernicious practice of separate and unequal schools. Unfortunately, despite the ruling and numerous efforts to integrate public schools across the country, our schools remain frustratingly segregated. A report last month cited New York State public schools as the most segregated in the nation. Although certainly this finding is due in large part to New York City schools, we're also encountering a new era of separate and unequal schools in our suburbs. Indeed, the nation is right now experiencing an historic demographic shift as more minority groups and recent immigrants move away from the cities and into the suburbs. But as suburban population becomes more diverse, we're also seeing economic, cultural, social, and political divides that undermine our best intentions to build strong schools and communities. This has all been made more difficult by widespread school district fragmentation in suburban regions. There are so many factors to consider at play: housing and property values, jobs and workforce issues, transportation and infrastructure, among others, not to mention old attitudes and fear of change. Just this very morning, did you see the editorial in the New York Times excoriating the Westchester County executive for not enforcing the fair housing decision there? So this is a very, very current topic. So given this new demographic and economic reality, the question is, how do we create and sustain diverse schools and communities and ensure all children have access to educational opportunity, equity, and excellence? These are truly complex and challenging issues, but fortunately, we have the best minds here today to share ideas, make critical connections between the factors, among the factors that contribute to the new face of segregation among suburban school districts, and then help us explore possible solutions. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to a leader who is moving the conversation forward, Roush Foundation President Nancy Rauch Douzinas. Nancy became president of the Roush Foundation in 1990 after a career of 20 years as a psychologist and family therapist. Since 2002, she's been leading the charge on Long Island to rebuild the region's economic engine and provide high-quality jobs. Key to this for Nancy has been a focus on identifying disparities among Long Island schools, which are the most segregated in the nation. The foundation has supported groundbreaking research by our own Amy Stewart Wells on this topic. She explores the impact of segregation on Long Island schools and recommends policy and structural changes to address the separate and unequal suburbs. The Roush Foundation also supports work at TC by Lynn Kagan, Doug Reddy, and Jeannie Brooks-Gunn. Work on ranging from early childhood services to K-12 public schools to demographic analysis, work that has significantly informed the content of today's very rich program. I also want to mention the Foundation's very generous support for our students through the Ruth Triber Rauch Scholarship Fund, named in honor of Nancy's late mother, who was a TC alumna. And I want to mention the fact that Nancy is a TC trustee, which we're so proud. In recognition of Nancy's extensive civic involvement and leadership, she was named to the Long Island Press Power List Hall of Fame, which noted that Nancy doesn't have all the answers, but she's fearless when it comes to championing the search and doing what she can to make Long Island a better place. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Rauch Douzinas.
It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this chance to speak on behalf of the Roush Foundation, which has sponsored today's symposium. The celebration of the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education is not a historic occasion. Rather, it's a time to reflect on the past, not on the past, but on the present and the future. How far have we come since this landmark decision, and how far do we have to go? Now, the Roush Foundation, as Susan said, is based on Long Island, where we're well aware of the challenges facing the suburbs. As Susan said too, Long Island is probably the most segregated school system. And as UCLA noted in their study, 4%, in 1989, 4% of the schools were considered intensely segregated. That number now has grown to 11%. Wrong direction. At the Roush Foundation, we publish the Long Island Index, which makes demographic data in a number of key areas available to the public to inform policy discussions. In the area of education, the Long Island Index tracks school poverty, race and ethnicity, English language learners, student stability, teacher education and turnover, academic performance, and college readiness. The stark reality on Long Island, as the index notes, is that Blacks and Hispanics are concentrated in high poverty schools, perpetuating the economic disparities among racial and ethnic groups. That's the crux of the problem that we now face in terms of segregation in suburban schools, that we've replaced the distinctions of race with distinctions of income, which too often result in distinctions of race. That's a situation that we must not allow to continue. It's bad enough to look back after 60 years and see that too little has changed. What will we see, say, after 70 or 80 years? Fortunately, solutions can be found right here at Teachers College and at other institutions that are researching educational strategies and practices and analyzing what works. We must focus on what we know works and scale those techniques. Many of the experts here today will talk further about what we know works. Carol Boris, principal of the Southside High School in Rockville Center, for instance, was integrally involved in an effort to eliminate tracking and has proven that it works. The creation of magnet schools has similarly shown to reduce income bias in schools by convening students from a diverse geography around shared interests. In Wake County, North Carolina, limits on the percentage of students eligible for free lunches in any one school have transformed the educational landscape. And we know, among other proven initiatives, pre-K works. Now, we've been fortunate at the Roush Foundation to have funded the research, as Susan said, of several Teacher College faculty members who are speaking today. Lynn Kagan, Doug Reddy, Michael Rebell, and Amy Stewart Wells. They're providing very valuable data and analysis that should inform our future actions. And also speaking today are several extraordinary leaders on Long Island who provide the practical expertise, commitment, and innovation needed to carry us forward into a much better, equitable future. They include, in addition to Carol Boris, Elaine Gross, president of Erase Racism, and Tom Rogers, superintendent of the Nassau County Board of Cooperative Educational Services. With the involvement of these extraordinary people and all of you who are here today, I'm very optimistic that we can make great strides in the future years toward eliminating the inequities in education that still exist today. And now, it's time to begin hearing from the experts. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Xavier de Souza Briggs. Xavier is an outstanding researcher, educator, author, policymaker, and foundation executive. He is vice president for economic opportunity and assets at the Ford Foundation, while also a faculty member on leave from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. From 2009 to 2011, he served as Associate Director of the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. Among his interests are inclusive economic growth and how rapidly changing societies, particularly in North America and Europe, can thrive, not just cope, with this increased ethnic diversity. He's author of The Geography of Opportunity, Democracy as Problem Solving, Civic Capacity in Communities Across the Globe, and Moving to Opportunity, the story of an American experiment to fight ghetto poverty. Please join me in welcoming Xavier to Souza Briggs.
It seems to me that we're here to talk about one of those hidden in plain sight issues, in that the stakes are huge, and they're clear now for those who are paying attention, but much of the body politic and the public conversation has not yet paid attention, and we need to change that. A gathering like this one gives us a chance to draw on the many kinds of expertise and wisdom that are in the room, and then share it, I hope, broadcast it widely, and that's crucial, since the stakes could not be higher for America, and especially the next generation. Let me add, on a final prefatory note, how great it is to be back at Teachers College. The commitment to educational opportunity and collective action and social justice runs deep here, as I learned in the classroom years ago. I will not say how many years. What I want to do with you is begin by taking stock of the moment in which we find ourselves as a country. And then I'd like to talk about where we go from here. And in particular, the things that give me hope and that call, I think, for political imagination and creative engagement as much as anything else. I can't do justice to the cutting-edge work you'll be hearing about and debating throughout the day, beginning in just a few minutes with this terrific panel, so I'm not going to try to do that. As Susan and Nancy said, many of the leading thinkers and risk-takers and innovators on these issues are right here in the room, which is fantastic. But as Nancy hinted in her intro, I can't seem to keep a job. So what I'd like to do is draw on a range of vantage points, okay? From working on federal policy and budgets in the White House, which is certainly one perspective, real insights, but also blind spots from serving that high up from the ground, to doing research and doing community planning a lot closer to the ground, to trying hard now in a new role to think about the ways in which philanthropy can contribute to lasting and transformative change. I'm going to try to draw on those multiple vantage points for what they are worth. For the Ford Foundation, this is a commitment, let me highlight, that runs back more than half a century to the civil rights movement, community-led reinvestment, open housing, and other breakthroughs and aspirations that helped move the country forward in an inclusive way. If I turn to what defines the moment, I think the headlines are familiar to everyone in this room. America has a fast-growing population. It's rapidly becoming majority minority, most rapidly in the suburbs, but in the context of staggering and truly historic levels of economic inequality. The ladder to the middle class is deeply broken, and poverty is up sharply, particularly over the years of the Great Recession and now its legacy. America is now mostly suburban in every sense. Most voting power is suburban, most poverty is suburban. Many of our immigrant gateways are suburbs, as I think you know. The foreclosure crisis hit hardest in the suburbs, especially among low-wealth families and families of color. And for all these reasons and more, suburb long ago stopped being a synonym for secure and prosperous. In that vein, segregation in our schools continues to be driven largely by segregated housing patterns, and the segregation between neighborhoods, which once dominated the headlines in places like Boston during the busing crisis, for example, it persists, as you know well, but it's dwarfed in some places by the segregation between school districts, i.e. by the lines that often divide or subdivide metropolitan regions into have and have not communities. And as Nancy said, race, racial and ethnic differences and differences of income and class intersect in some really powerful and worrisome ways if you believe in equal opportunity. What also defines the moment, however, is that many of both types, the have and the have not communities, are suburban, and their futures are interdependent. And I think that's a piece of what we're here to explore. The old city-suburban binary, I would argue, stopped being useful years ago. It's not that central cities don't face big challenges of their own. Remember, we're having this conversation in New York City, the nation's capital of income inequality. It's not that central cities can't lead in their own way. They can and they must, but it's time we laid that old city versus suburb mental model to rest, as my friend Myron Orfield, who's here in the audience, and others have been encouraging us to do for some time now. That divide, that binary in the way we think and the way we approach these issues, it is literally blinding us to the task at hand, of that of creating a broadly and deeply inclusive nation, and as soon as we can. And finally, in the way of taking stock, there is the growth model, the way we develop our metropolitan regions, or our city regions if you prefer, and the way we absorb new populations. Our dominant model of regional growth and change continues to reinforce that segregation I highlighted a moment ago. It does so in the way we use infrastructure policy to subsidize new development in more affluent communities while disinvesting in struggling older ones, in the way we concentrate affordable housing in disadvantaged areas rather than creating affordable places to live throughout a region and close to transit wherever possible, in the way we leave exclusionary land use policies in place, in the way we fail to make schools and school attendance zones welcoming and effective for an increasingly diverse population of families and kids. Simply put, we have a model of development, one, by the way, in which all levels of government play a role and bear a responsibility. We have a model of development that too often becomes an expression of what Robert Rauch once referred to as the secession of the successful. And it's a huge problem. In the aggregate, despite that image of success, it is a model that leaves us all poorer. It wastes so much human potential, it breeds mistrust, it fosters crime, and as more and more evidence shows, it undermines economic prosperity. Let me take a moment to underline that last point. Inequality is not only a moral imperative. Tackling it is not only a moral imperative. Inequality is not only a serious threat to democracy, and we have more and more evidence of that, it's also bad for the economy and bad for business. And segregated communities and schools are a cornerstone of that inequality. When it comes to the divided suburbs, for example, you would be hard-pressed to fashion a better mechanism for what sociologists like to call social reproduction, the processes that reproduce inequality and disadvantage from one decade and one generation to the next. The system of spatial come social exclusion is maddeningly effective. And all too often, it's buried under what would seem to be the least promising political issues: zoning reform, revenue reform, affordable housing. And yet, from coast to coast, we also see a new generation of efforts to build a very different, a far more inclusive America, acting regionally more and more, but also zeroing in on the high-leverage moves like how school attendance zones are drawn in a single suburban jurisdiction, engaging stakeholders who are unusual suspects, and investing in places that can attract and retain families of all kinds. In other words, changing the development model one campaign at a time, one policy at a time sometimes, but changing it at the roots of these big systems, and, this is important, the grassroots of American politics. Let me name a few examples. In Pennsauken, New Jersey, and other mixed-income, diverse suburban communities, banded together in an effort called Build One New Jersey. It's an affiliate of Build One America, and folks are here today from Build One America and Build One New Jersey. They abolished regional contribution agreements, and that's not a riveting battle cry, right? Politically. think about what we work against. Abolished regional contribution agreements. But here's how: by getting the public to understand that technical-sounding, obscure-sounding policy amounted to an unfair loophole, a policy that let wealthy towns buy their way out of a statewide affordable housing obligation, transferring those obligations to fiscally weaker communities that are more vulnerable to segregation and decline. Those efforts fed, in turn, into Together New Jersey, which used a HUD grant for equity-focused regional planning. It included an in-depth analysis of North Jersey's 339 school districts and produced a plan that recognizes that housing policy is school policy. It advocates a wide range of recommendations to produce racially and economically integrated neighborhoods as the foundation of racially and economically integrated and successful neighborhood schools. And now the larger region, this tri-state area of more than 23 million people, will undertake an ambitious regional planning process. Only the fourth ever, by the way, in the history of this region. Heavy on community engagement, not just the technical wizardry that planners may bring to the table, but an effort to think about economic competitiveness, environmental resilience, of course, and educational opportunity and related issues, and about how the fortunes of suburbs in New Jersey or Long Island and neighborhoods in Manhattan and cities in Connecticut are all interconnected. It's a process that's spearheaded by an innovative regional planning agency, supported by Ford and other funders, and informed by advisors from urban regions around the world. And it's going to help us understand those challenges and then act together to tackle them and reposition, we hope, this region for the long term. The key is that good planning doesn't just produce plans, it produces constituencies for ideas, and even new networks to help make them happen. Take, for example, Denver's Mile High Connect. It's a collaborative that brings together housing, economic development, health, transportation, and education advocates and funders to ensure that the build-out of the region's transportation system coordinates with those other systems and benefits a broad mix of people, including low-income families. Here's just one product of that inclusive approach to engagement. A parents group there in Denver has pioneered a new transportation solution to the barriers their kids faced in getting to the schools they most wanted, and even to after-school programs at other schools. It's called the Success Express. It's meeting the needs of a broad mix of families and saving the schools hundreds of thousands of dollars each year. Here's the thing, there are several pieces in play here, and it's not my intent at all to say that we have the momentum we need yet, at least not everywhere we need it, or that we have all the answers, but I believe the tectonics are shifting. The federal government's re-entry into regional planning has been crucial to the new energy, stakeholder engagement, and creative problem solving we've seen. I'm talking in particular about the Sustainable Communities effort launched by the Obama administration, linking HUD and DOT and the EPA, HUD's Sustainable Communities grants, DOT's Tiger grants through the Recovery Act, and other critical investments. The president just a few days ago outlined a proposal for more of this, by the way. Those and the critical investments have created jobs, as intended, but also spurred uncommon dialogues and networks, not just plans that sit on a shelf. And in many cases, the Ford Foundation has supported these collaborative efforts by building up the capacity of organizations that represent low-income people and communities of color to participate in a meaningful way at these collaborative tables. And we hope that's a focus that will catch on in philanthropy, Nancy, let's hope, more broadly. That was my plug, by the way, to the philanthropy world. Get with the Social Justice Inclusive America program, please, and quickly. Now, let me underline a few things these locally led efforts have in common. The first is what I would call creative civics. I'm talking about the need to engage with both the grassroots and the grass tops, the decision makers and resource providers, but also everyday people in their roles as engaged activists, and even, as you heard in the Denver example, even co-creators of change. And then to link them, the grassroots and the grass tops, in flexible ways. The second thread, it seems to me, is nurturing engagement and capacity among suburbs, many of which lack fiscal and staff capacity and don't get much attention from the urban innovation crowd. perhaps not surprisingly. In the Chicago region, for example, we have a grantee called the Metropolitan Planning Council, and they've worked with partners to link clusters of suburbs that face common redevelopment challenges so they can tackle them in innovative ways together. Now, not all of these work on education directly or immediately, but there in the Chicago suburbs, for example, they've created and launched transit-oriented development funds and a land bank to return vacant land to productive use, things that would have been much too complex for any one municipality to tackle effectively on its own. And I think you can see where I'm going with this story. These are the forces that shift the terrain underneath families and schools and do so much to determine whether communities will be healthy, vibrant, and attractive to a wide range of families. Put those moves together with strong magnet schools and other proven approaches that Nancy referred to in public education, and the gains would be extraordinary. The third nascent thread, in this drama is a much more intensive focus on state governments as arbiters of opportunity in America. Education advocates, it seems to me, know this well, given the central role that states play in curriculum standards, school financing, and so much more. But advocates for affordable housing and community reinvestment in the broad sense, the range of issues I've talked about, they've been slower to get there. For a time, we acted as though we could save the world one neighborhood and one municipality at a time. Yet the big systems and rules that states control in labor and environmental standards and redistricting policies and voting laws, of course, all of those so fundamental, but also infrastructure dollars, the control of how localities raise revenue, the brokering of cross-jurisdiction fair share policies for affordable housing, like those in New Jersey, Massachusetts, and other states. These are critical, and this new generation of collaboratives and coalitions is much more savvy about that. Fourth and finally, there is the pattern that my friend at MIT, Phil Thompson, would call deep pluralism. It begins, it seems to me, with a willingness to deal with race and class and other stubborn divides, but without falling into rigid assumptions about how particular groups think or what their interests are. White homeowners will think and vote this way. The teachers' union will vote and mobilize that way. Families of color or low-income immigrant workers some other way. Creative organizers and policy entrepreneurs know better than to think like that, and we all need to learn better than that. From where I sit, deep pluralism is a work in progress, to put it mildly. But I think it takes us beyond, frankly, the multiculturalism that my generation came of age arguing for and that our elders who paved the way for us made possible. Don't get me wrong, given a choice between a bigoted, hunkered down monoculture and an incomplete and fractious multiculture, I will take the upgrade. I'll take the 2.0. I just don't think America can afford to get stuck there. We need to be forging communities of commitment around fairness and other core values and around the shared interest we have in a more secure future together. And we can only do it by crossing these boundaries and getting into relationship with each other, tackling shared concerns. Simple tolerance or room for every group's traditions and narratives is not enough in my view. They're essential because mutual respect and human dignity hinge on those things, but they're not enough to build the country we want together. It's a collective project. It calls for a deep and active pluralism. And as I think about where we are and where we need to be as a country, these are the lessons that stand out. We have to think and act across the old silos. I do this kind of policy, schools or housing or transit, not that other kind. Can't think that way anymore, it seems to me. Forget the cities are poor, suburbs are rich, or cities are racially and economically diverse and suburbs are not thinking. Those things haven't been true for a long time, if they ever were. Break the old mental models, get people rethinking and problem solving together, and pay attention to the extraordinary powers of states, which are much less stuck in place than Washington is at the moment. Sometimes, by the way, that's for the better, and sometimes it's for the worse that they're not stuck in place, if you believe in inclusion. States are pushing in both directions, both for and against in this country. But the stakes are big in both those directions, and that's the point. Things can move. They are moving. I want to close by thanking you for your presence here today. I want to thank you in advance for listening hardest to whatever ideas make you most uncomfortable, and for the energy you'll commit to the work ahead. I believe we are at our best when we embrace the idea that the country is a work in progress, that America itself is the greatest experiment. Thank you for the things you will do to make it a more just and successful one. Thank you so much. The Mile High Connects work is one good example, and I would sort of point to two things. And the first, I promise, is not a plug for that now decade-old book, but in the conclusion of the Geography of Opportunity, this is one of the central things I focused on, is how we get there to build the political will and political muscle, since we know, in effect, where we need to get. And it seems to me that one of the keys to that, you can't just sort of write narrative or try to persuade on the facts or whatnot. You've got to think about stakeholder interests in very, very pragmatic ways. I don't have to tell you this. And what I tried to do there, though there's nothing profound to the simple sort of outline in that particular piece of work, was to say, think about the range of stakeholders, from regional employers to employers rooted in particular suburban communities. Think about faith institutions. If you're a houser, think about school districts and what they are solving for and what their interests are. And then don't offer a generic pitch on the wonders of taking a particular path, but think about how this agenda addresses the interests of those stakeholders. The second point I'd make is that partnerships and coalitions, in my view, are not the same thing, and we throw all these words around in America. So Mile High Connects and some of the other things that I pointed to, including the work in New Jersey, some days they act as coalitions that win support for particular decisions. In other words, coalitions are about authorizing things, authorizing action in a given direction, whether it's a corporate board saying, a bank saying yes to something, or a school board, or a city council, or a state legislature, or governor. Partnerships, in my view, are more about producing the impact on the ground. For example, figuring a way that a philanthropy and a local school district and a group of employers can work together on school leaving or on early career success or something like that. That's a partnership that produces a particular kind of outcome. Don't get me wrong, incredibly important. But the coalitions are too, and they take political action, and we can't let that be a bad word in America, as though things get grubby when they get political. No, we're talking about people's interests and stakes. A number of these efforts I pointed to are part coalition and part partnership. I would say that the Mile High Connects effort is one such. Some others are more on the sort of coalition side, tackling particular kinds of policies. Okay. How do you begin to break the political power that holds segregation together on Long Island? Well, let me say this, and this is, it seems to me, a topic for exploration today, not only in the Long Island context, of course, but in many, many similar places where things seem to be held in place, held together, as the question says, in a really powerful way. Well, a piece of it is building those more uncommon coalitions, and I firmly believe it begins with being willing to imagine people's interests and engage with them in innovative ways. Even with the best of progressive intent, one can fall into sort of labeling and stereotyping blocks of people and blocks of interest. And at the end of the day, that's not going to get us there. It's not productive, I think, as an organizing strategy. But it seems to me that, as I heard a colleague describe it the other day, there are moments to work very, very directly on a problem that may seem to be intractable. And there are moments to light fires and let things burn to the middle, if you see what I'm saying. I think that what we're seeing now is a set of changes kind of happening all at one time. Sandy was a big shock. It has started a much more top-of-the-fold conversation about resilience, about changing the fabric of place, transit and access to transit and walkable communities. All of that is top of mind in ways that it wasn't just 10 or 20 years ago. And so is, I think, the growing insight that equity contributes to economic growth and success. We at the Ford Foundation and others that support this kind of work see more and more examples of this in the organizing of groups like Small Business Majority, which targets nothing less than winning the minimum wage fight, by the way, on behalf of workers, and two, changing the way that people think about what small businesses want, to broaden the conversation, essentially to say a more inclusive America is going to be far more economically successful, and to help carry that message, small business to small business, and state campaign to state campaign, and that I think is hugely exciting. So I'm not offering a ton in the way of specifics, I'm mindful, but it's these kinds of things, it seems to me, where you bring unusual suspects into play, you broaden the coalition, and you chip away at this sort of, one or two or three moves at a time, knowing that it's going to take that really to move things. I also think, and Nancy outlined this so eloquently in her opening remarks, a piece of it is proving success, proving you can change and the sky won't fall in some way that the doomsayers have predicted. That's fundamentally important for building confidence.